Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall, I'm a member of the NERRS Science Collaborative staff. We're glad you can join us today as we kick off the 2020 webinar series with this webinar titled Engaging Communities and Role-Playing Simulations to Advance Climate Planning. The webinar today is part of a monthly series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the Science Collaborative. Webinars also feature projects from Science Collaborative team members as they engage the reserve system. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research, and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The NERRS Science Collaborative is one of the research funding mechanisms for the reserve system. In addition to providing grants, we also work to promote the research and engagement happening across the reserve system through webinars like today's. All attendees are muted upon entry, and we will be handling questions via the question feature in the GoToWebinar console. We'll have time for questions during the middle and end portions of the webinar, so when we switch speakers, we'll have a brief moment where we can answer some questions. However, we encourage you to submit any questions you have as they occur to you throughout the webinar by entering them into the questions field on the console. We have two speakers today, both of whom have experience running the role-playing simulations in their respective communities. Maeve Snyder is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the North Inlet Winyah Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. She has also worked in science communication and education throughout the coastal southeast. Annie Cox is the Coastal Training Coordinator at the Wells Reserve. She develops and organizes workshops and trainings for professionals working with and making decisions that affect our natural resources. Annie was part of the New England Climate Adaptation Project, which wrapped up in 2014, and we're glad she's willing to dig up some of her old files and share some reflections with us on that collaborative research project. Annie and Maeve's projects are great examples of the research and science transfer activities that the Science Collaborative supports. Each of their projects developed a creative way to share climate information with coastal communities, as you'll see, and the two projects also show a great transfer of ideas across regions and reserves. Before I hand it over to Maeve, we do have a couple quick polling questions from our speakers, so if you could go ahead and answer those when you see them at your screen. Got a nice distribution here. This is interesting to see. It looks like a lot of people are interested in community engagement techniques. From the amount of reading that I've done in the background for these projects, I think this is definitely a great example. Both these projects are great examples of that. So this should be an interesting webinar for all of you. We have one more question before we hand it over, so I'll go ahead and launch that one as well. Awesome. So a lot of people have actually participated in these before, and a few people it's new to, and some people have even led them. So I think this is a good distribution as well. So this should be interesting for everyone, I think. So with that, I will hand it over to Maeve to start our presentation here for us. Maeve, take it away.
Well, I can just start us off with an introduction to Georgetown County, South Carolina. Where are we? This project, like Nick mentioned, it was a science transfer grant. So we're really beginning at the end here because our project transferred climate adaptation knowledge and tools from the New England Climate Adaptation Project, or NECAP, and applied them in Georgetown, South Carolina, so we called it GCAP. So Georgetown is located between two major centers of population growth and economic development in South Carolina. Charleston is south and Myrtle Beach is north. Georgetown's a really interesting county because it's got so many distinct communities within it. There's a large rural inland area that has a lot of industry, and then there's a major river that creates a peninsula that's more coastal, affluent, lots of retirees. And so these distinct communities create a challenge for any sort of planning, but especially around contentious issues like climate. So the natural setting of Georgetown County, South Carolina, is really dominated by water. And that was a major theme of this project, was just living with water and the challenges it creates in our community. The reserve where I work has two estuaries, North Inlet, which is dominated by salt marsh creeks, and Winyah Bay, which is a river-dominated estuary with the third largest watershed on the East Coast. So it's just a huge land area where the impacts of what goes on in the watershed all makes its way to Georgetown County, and it covers the northeast corner of South Carolina, big part of North Carolina. And so living with water really is a major aspect of life in this county. So I like this picture because it really shows so much of the history of Georgetown in one place. The earliest inhabitants of Georgetown, South Carolina, were indigenous people. During colonization, Europeans brought enslaved Africans that made rice cultivation possible in this area through their labor. And actually in this picture, you can see the city bell tower is right near the Georgetown Rice Museum that talks about the history of rice cultivation that made Georgetown a really economically prosperous city in the 18th century. And that museum also talks about the history of Gullah Geechee communities. Gullah Geechee culture is, well, it's the cultural heritage of enslaved Africans in coastal Southeast communities. And so they're an important cultural aspect of our community. After the Civil War, rice cultivation declined and other industry popped up in Georgetown. So you can see in the background, there is a paper mill, and that is supplied by a large timber industry in the inland parts of the county. There is a port authority, and there's an active steel mill in Georgetown County as well. More recently, Georgetown County has been defined by 4 consecutive years of extreme weather events. We've had multiple hurricanes that have resulted in flooding in different areas of the county. And so we recognize a need for climate adaptation, but we also saw that this is a community where discussing climate could be contentious or really not even on people's radar. Several years of storms have made it much more of an issue in the forefront of people's minds, but we didn't really have a hospitable climate for talking about climate issues. So we recognized that the NECAP project provided a model of how to break down barriers to productive dialogue on these issues. So I want to introduce one of the project partners. Shortly before we applied for this science transfer grant, Georgetown was designated a United Nations Regional Center of Expertise for Sustainable Development. And we locally call that UNRCE, we call it Georgetown RISE. And it's a network of organizations working on sustainable development issues, including the NERRS and Coastal Carolina University. And so we sort of recognized RISE as a good network to convene people to begin these discussions and as a vehicle for applying this role-play simulation methodology. So I want to give you a little information about our process. And actually, a precursor to this step even was to take the case study from the NECAP project and do it with people in the county, have them do the role-play simulation. And what we heard overwhelmingly was that we need this sort of process in our community. It's too difficult to have these conversations. We need an emotional distance to even just practice what these dialogues would look like. But what we also heard was that even though a lot of the stakeholders were the same or the issues were the same, we heard that New England is not Georgetown. They're too different, and the case study just didn't ring true. So we started by gathering relevant climate data for Georgetown County. We wanted to start from an evidence-based approach, and we conducted stakeholder interviews to say what would be a representative stakeholder planning group for this area. We then used all that data to develop a role-play simulation case study, which we piloted with community members to get their feedback. After that, we rolled out the simulation to community workshops. And we also hosted a train the trainer so that other organizations or other communities in the coastal Southeast could use this and apply it. We wrote the simulation to be representative of Georgetown, but also to ring true for any community essentially within the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor from coastal North Carolina to like St. Augustine, Florida. With those community workshops, we gathered feedback, we conducted surveys of participants, and we reported out to the stakeholders who initially supported this project and our local elected officials. And maybe jumping ahead a little bit here, but we're now in the what comes next phase, the action and evaluation step, and I'll talk more about this at the end. So going back to that climate data, we really wanted to provide all workshop participants with a picture of the future climate conditions in Georgetown County. We wanted them to practice making planning decisions with a long-term mindset and the best available projection data for Georgetown's climate variables. And so we worked with climate geographers from CISA, the Carolinas Integrated Sciences and Assessments, to produce this data. And I'll just quickly show you a little bit of the interpretation we did with participants. We would pull out relevant climate metrics like the average temperature of a summer night. It's expected to increase. We paired those with UN Sustainable Development Goals, saying if it's hotter at night, that's going to impact public health. People will have to spend more on utilities, and that can impact economic growth in the county. Another example would be the frequency of storms that drop a whole bunch of rain at once. This has been a major issue in our area, and that's expected to happen more often. And that has implications for industry, infrastructure, economics, and then just the sustainability of our communities. So participants got to see data like this, and I mean, they were already coming with personal experiences with these storms. Here's Hurricane Florence, and you can see those unprecedented rainfalls in North Carolina. They actually, a lot of that water made its way down here because of our huge watershed. And you can see that's actually my boyfriend's parents canoeing down their street. So that was Hurricane Florence was interesting because it was a time-delayed flood where we had the storm, which didn't impact us as badly as predicted, but then we had the flooding that came after. And then sea level rise is a chronic issue in our community. And this, the NOAA Coastal Flood Exposure Mapper shows that a lot of critical infrastructure, schools, fire departments are located in vulnerable areas in Georgetown. So with all of this in mind, how do we make decisions as communities? So this project and this approach is really based around consensus decision making. And the main through line to the New England project and our project here was the Consensus Building Institute. We worked with a professional in role-play simulation development from CBI, and her name's Carrie Hewlett. She helped us to craft our role-play simulation using that stakeholder data and just the local issues of the county. So for those who said that they've never used role-play simulations before, it's all new to you, they're a well-supported approach to preparing for situations that are either too dangerous or too impractical to deal with in real life. So the military and medical fields use role-play simulations all the time, and they increase how well people perform when they're confronted with challenging scenarios. This project's really interesting because it applies that same approach, but to community planning discussions. And the idea is that by practicing in a low stakes kind of fictionalized scenario, people are better able to empathize. They're just better equipped to go to those real life planning discussions, able to consider other perspectives and have productive conversations. So I want to introduce the case study that we developed for Georgetown. If you can imagine, this is 6 people seated around a table. Here's a representative stakeholder group. We have a county director of sustainability. We have a representative of the Gullah Geechee community, a small business owner and artisan. We have a director of a local business alliance. We have a homeowner and local resident. This person is someone representing the more coastal affluent area of the county. We have the local superintendent of schools and an elected official from a rural inland town. So if you can imagine attending one of these workshops, you're in a group of people and you are assigned one of these roles, either randomly or deliberately given a role that differs from your own identity. And you get the following challenge. You're told that shovel-ready projects with community support and consensus behind them are more likely to receive funding for implementation, whether it's applying for hazard mitigation funding or just setting the county budget for the coming year. And your challenge as a stakeholder group is to reach consensus on which projects to prioritize. And so we did these workshops in a number of different communities in the county, making sure that we were representing different demographics and different geographic areas of the county. Altogether, we had over 300 people who participated in the role plays, the Train the Trainer. Our participants ranged from high school students to retirees. We covered all sorts of areas. And we then tried to encourage regional replication with the Train the Trainer in Charleston. So what does it look like when you have people running these simulations? It mostly looks like people in a room talking, but that's what it would be in the real deal as well. So this was a community workshop in Murrells Inlet, which is a coastal community. Here we did it with undergraduate students from Coastal Carolina University. And I'm going to share some of the results of the surveys that we gave out to workshop participants. So we asked participants, how concerned are you about climate impacts? And what we saw is that there's a really high level of concern across the county. So some variation, but even in these different communities, people have high levels of concern about climate impacts. Notably, when we did this with high school and college students, their levels of concern were a lot lower. This is an interesting result considering the presence of youth in climate adaptation action, and it's an interesting result that doesn't really match up with adults in our community. The other note I'll make here is that people voluntarily chose to come to these workshops, so there is some self-selection going on with these results. But it is interesting in a county as diverse as Georgetown, this is something that unified communities. We asked people what likely climate impacts are they most concerned about. And again, there was a lot of agreement among the different communities. Flooding rose to the top as a main concern. Health impacts. This was really big, in particular with inland communities, and then infrastructure. Those were the main issues that people were discussing, and we saw this in the workshops. Those were the solutions that got the greatest weight in prioritization. And then we asked people, who is most responsible for preparing for climate impacts? Across the board, people are looking to local government for climate adaptation. And we really stressed with our workshop participants that we're focused on adaptation as opposed to mitigation. And we tried to clarify those distinctions for them. So local government really is the primary driver of adaptation and change in our communities. Some feedback that we heard from workshop participants after having gone through the role play simulation. Some of these quotes include, I learned to stop pointing fingers and see myself as part of the solution. I can advocate for things that I don't agree with. I learned about the importance of short-term and long-term thinking, and the importance of bringing all stakeholders to the table. We heard that from so many people. They want stakeholder engagement in these planning processes. And then it was a safe place for elected officials to discuss unsafe topics. So after doing these community workshops and reporting back to our local county council, we're now looking at what the next steps are. But for anyone thinking of applying this case study or any other role play simulation in your communities, I want to just mention some lessons we learned doing this project. So being sensitive to issues that participants might be facing. In particular, we launched our community workshops the week that Hurricane Florence hit. And so we had to actually postpone a lot of our events because it was not considerate to be asking people to simulate climate impacts when they were dealing with real flooding and tangible impacts in their lives and in their neighborhoods. So that also threw a wrench into our project timeline, but that was a really cool outcome because we had a high school teacher who read about the pilot project in the paper and invited us into her class to do the role play simulation with students. High school students were not part of the original target audience, but it was actually really illuminating to do it with them and to engage them in planning and giving them the opportunity to imagine themselves as decision makers. So that was a neat outcome that wasn't part of our original plan. Another lesson when doing these kinds of simulations with communities, information overload was a problem. Depending on the level of background knowledge and familiarity, a lot of participants needed a lot of filling in the gaps with climate data, with planning and different planning roles to be able to imagine themselves in this community planning scenario. The last lesson that I want to emphasize is the value of community ambassadors. And this is a best practice anytime you're doing community outreach, but it bears repeating. It really made so much of a difference to be able to host events within these communities when we partnered with a trusted community group such as Black River United Way and other local nonprofits, or with local government. So very grateful for the partners that we had on this project. Based on what we heard in the surveys and the feedback we got on these workshops, we provided recommendations to our local county council. We recommended community task forces that deal with policy improvements, capital investments, future infrastructure, looking for state and federal funding to support infrastructure improvements, and building resilience into the comprehensive planning process for the county. And then as part of the study, we have that downscaled climate projection data. I actually presented that just this morning. This is kind of a next step spoiler at a resilience task force that includes a lot of the stakeholders involved in disaster response and recovery in Georgetown County. So that's a direct application of data that was produced in this project, and just a first step in moving towards these recommendations.
The interest of time, I think I'll just try to ask you one or two quick ones, and we can move to Annie's presentation, save the rest for the end. As a reminder, we do collect all these questions and put them in the webinar brief, so you can, if your question is not answered, it will show up in the webinar brief. So the first question we have here is, how did you get participants for this to participate in the role playing? Was it random? Was there any incentive?
Our main incentive was food, which usually works pretty well. And then we just advertised the events through as many different networks and contact lists as possible. And again, those community ambassadors helped so much.
And we had another question that was geared towards what the demographics were like. Were there, what kind of people were participating in the role-playing simulations? Did you have a mix of political ideologies, age, any other sort of interesting demographic standouts?
Yeah, we had, our demographics were largely representative of the communities where we had these local workshops. So these sorts of public engagement opportunities often are dominated by retirees, people who have time and who have, you know, the access to the information. But within some of the more underserved communities, we actually had great representation of like different age groups, different types of jobs and backgrounds. And then bringing in high school students, I mean, they not only participated in their classrooms, but then that teacher offered extra credit to students who came and participated in the community workshops. That was really important because we had one community workshop where a high school student was seated in a group with the town mayor, and they were planning together. So, you know, some bias towards older retirees, but pretty diverse demographics.
And we'll ask one more quick question before we move on to Annie's presentation, and that is a specific one that is for your presentation. And that question was, did people get to vote for more than one impact?
They chose up to 3.
Up to 3. Excellent.
Yeah, and actually the surveys I'm sorry, Nick. The surveys they took are available online, so you can see what those were like as well.
Excellent. So we'll go ahead and move forward here. I'm being conscious of time. I know we have a lot of other questions, and I apologize if your question was not answered right away, but we'll go ahead and move on to Annie's portion of the presentation, so we can hopefully leave some time for more Q&A at the end. So Annie, take it away.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I forgot I was muted. To back it up, our project was a 2-year neuroscience collaborative funded participatory action research project that kicked off in 2012. And that was called the New England Climate Adaptation Project. And I'll try not to refer to it as NECAP. And this was a collaboration among the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Consensus Building Institute, University of New Hampshire provided the downscale data, and the 4 New England NERRS and a participating community. So we had the town of Wells, Maine, and the other reserves partnered with the cities of Dover, New Hampshire, Barnstable, Massachusetts, and Cranston, Rhode Island. And I'll share a little bit with you from each community. So Wells, Maine is a town of 10,000 year-round residents on the southern coast of Maine. Tourism is a major business in this town, with area beaches swelling the town's population to 40,000 in the summer months. Other natural resources include our reserve and the Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge. The town's barrier beaches and estuary give it a unique ecological setting. Wells is one of the fastest growing communities in Maine. Development in the town's 60 square miles is concentrated along the coastline and inland along Route 1. Dover is a coastal city in southeastern New Hampshire with a population of about 30,000, making Dover the largest community in New Hampshire Seacoast region. While only a portion of Dover is located directly on the estuary, tidal rivers run through the city. Approximately 10% of the Dover residents live below poverty level. The town of Barnstable, Massachusetts is home to about 45,000 year-round residents. It is the largest town, both size and population, on Cape Cod. It's actually a city, but they call themselves a town. The town comprises of 7 villages. While Barnstable has a fairly diversified economy, tourism and maritime industry both play key roles, and the future of these industries relies greatly on the protection of their ecology, natural resources, beaches, and coastal infrastructure. They have 170 miles of coastline, and it's highly vulnerable to climate change impacts, including sea level rise and damage associated with intensified storms. And the city of Cranston is located along Narragansett Bay and is part of the Providence metropolitan area. A range of riverine, forest, and marine ecosystems are found in the area, which is home to more than 80,000 year-round residents. A number of small and medium-sized businesses support the local economy, which consists primarily of retail, healthcare, social assistance, and professional, scientific, and technical services. So for our project, the goals were to assess local climate change risks, to identify key barriers to and opportunities for adaptation, and test the use of role-play simulation as a tool for educating and engaging the public about climate change adaptation, and enhancing the readiness of communities to collectively manage climate change risks. And as Maeve explained, role-play simulation is an experiential learning exercise that asks participants to assume roles and imagine they are in a mock decision-making process. So our work and products were similar to Georgetown's examples, and we had for each community a summary risk assessment, a stakeholder assessment, and our project did public polling in each community. So we had pre and post polling from pre and post role play simulations to see if playing them percolated throughout the community. And as well, of course, the role play simulations based on local context and downscaled climate data. And all of this was compiled into a case study for each community. And a book was written and published in 2015 about the entire project and lessons learned by the Consensus Building Institute, called Managing Climate Risks in Coastal Communities. So I'll be drawing a lot from that book and from the case studies. So the summary risk assessments provided actionable climate risk information for each town that was directly relevant and served as a better decision support tool than what was available at the time, which in 2012 were national or large-scale regional assessments. Climate change impacts for New England are increased precipitation, hotter hot days, fewer cold days, and sea level rise. And these trends fluctuated per community, but using the downscaled climate data. So for example, not surprisingly, Dover is like a little more inland on a tidal river, will receive less sea level rise impacts than Wells, which has a low-lying sandy beach. And the more southern Cranston and Barnstable will have less extreme cold days, as well as in Dover. And Dover, of the 4 communities, will have more extreme hot days. There was a concerted effort to include all viewpoints into the assessment for the stakeholder assessment to gain a diversity of views within the town on climate change and adaptation. While attitudes in the communities varied by degree, the 4 towns showed people were concerned. And based on these interviews, the reports identified key threats like beach erosion, flooding, stormwater, impacts, tourism, destruction of private and public property, current local adaptation efforts and options. So for Wells, this was anything related to reducing their vulnerability, as they were not explicitly working on climate change adaptation. And obstacles to adaptation, lack of knowledge, disbelief, finances, or lack of political will. Most stakeholders perceived a lack of knowledge or disbelief in climate change as one of the primary challenges to tackling climate adaptation or taking action. And an important finding for us for the project was when during the stakeholder interviews, participants were shown local climate projection information. So for example, a jump in having 4 days above 90 degrees in Wells to 21 by mid-century made climate change feel real to the folks that we were interviewing. It allowed them to translate climate change into local impacts that meant something to them. And it showed that this is a local issue, so not just a national or international issue. It brought climate change home. And the role play simulations, just as Maeve explained, each game was tailored to each community based on the findings from the stakeholder and summary risk assessment. Participants were given a character that is different than their everyday role. Tables of 7 players, with the roles listed here, had an hour to reach consensus about an adaptation policy option to recommend. So each community grappled with a slightly different issue centered on flooding in a fictional community quite similar to their own. And the games were played with 115 to 170 people per community, and I think that we did about 500 for New England. And as you can see in the picture here, we are feeding them at a restaurant. So food was very important for drawing people in. And because participants were surveyed before they played the game and then after they played the game or the simulation, the team was able to measure how playing the simulation impacted them. So they found it increased their concern about local climate change risks. It increased a sense of local collective responsibility for preparing for and managing climate change risks. It increased confidence in local adaptation action. It enhanced understanding of others' perspectives and appreciation for the need for collective action and stakeholder engagement. And it enriched participants' understanding of climate change risks and adaptation, and introduced pathways forward and actionable solutions. So a lot of what Maeve had shared with us. And I remember when we played the game in Wells, one of our participants asked after the games, well, why don't we just do this? Meaning create a local task force to implement adaptation policy. So public polling was done before the games were played in 2013 and then after in 2014. And for context, Superstorm Sandy hit in 2012, which in hindsight seems like a very pivotal moment in climate consciousness for us in the Northeast. So I'll share highlights from the polling and talk about them in relationship to the stakeholder assessments. 100 people were randomly polled per community. And if you'd like to dig more into that data, it's available for each community case study as well as in the book Managing Risk. So when asked, how concerned are you about climate change impacts, we found most people are somewhat to very concerned about climate change impacts. And when asked how confident they are about that their town will respond to climate-related risks, we found that people are not very confident that their town will respond to climate-related risks. And when asked who should be responsible for preparing their community, we found people assign more responsibility to individuals and the federal government than to the local government. And when asked how significant do you think climate change should be versus will be in your town's planning and decision-making over the next 10 years, we found people would like their town to do something about climate change, but don't think it actually will. So to summarize this information, I think it's best captured in the book Managing Risk. I'll quote, prior to the New England Climate Adaptation Project, the public officials in our partner towns underestimated how concerned residents in their own communities were about climate risk. Meanwhile, the residents of these communities, while concerned about local climate change risks, had no sense that they needed to push their elected and appointed officials to take appropriate action. In other words, many people didn't see responding to climate change risk as a local problem, assuming, for example, that the federal government was doing something about it. When pressed, very few had confidence in the ability of their community to respond effectively. For all these reasons and more, there was no shared sense of urgency. So now you're probably thinking 5 years later, what are the communities doing now? So here is a list of measurable activities that can be seen across the communities. And I'll go a little more in depth with Wells, Dover, and Barnstable. So I know from working on the Wells project, it's hard to directly link actions from projects, but for us, this was our first time engaging with the community of Wells, and it really opened the door for back and forth engagement from then on. So this project rolled into a smaller NERRS science collaborative transfer project with Jack Cousteau in New Jersey called the Sandy Dialogues that engaged decision makers in our area in a peer-to-peer transfer of knowledge from decision makers impacted by Superstorm Sandy. So what I mean by all that is that we just put our decision makers in a van and drove them down to Tuckerton, New Jersey. And from that experience, the town began engaging citizens in emergency preparedness, planning for future temporary storage of storm debris, as well as the communities, including a sea level rise chapter and its comprehensive plan update. Similarly for Dover, these findings from the project gave the community the green light on addressing climate change. They started a climate committee, worked on and updated stormwater regs and climate change in mind, and initiated some groundwater impact studies, and have participated in several regional resilience-based projects. Steve Miller from the Great Bay Reserve in New Hampshire says, and I don't think he thought I was going to quote him, in short, since the New England Climate Adaptation Project, Dover has been a leader in climate work among municipalities in coastal New Hampshire. And then similarly, the director of Coit Bay Reserve in Massachusetts shared that Barnstable is now moving forward on a number of fronts on climate change preparedness, planning, and strengthening resilience. So you can check out Resilient Cape Cod and the Cape Cod Coastal Planner. This is a tool to help communities plan for the impacts of sea level rise, storms, and erosion. As well, they now participate in the FEMA community rating system. So stepping back, I'd like to iterate what worked for the project, because these are lessons for anyone working with communities to prepare for and manage climate change risks. The project was really about enhancing a community's readiness to collectively respond to climate change. And this is done by bringing the climate change home. So not just about increasing concern, but sharing local risks and impacts with the downscale data and sharing solutions so people see a path forward to manage risk. Making data tangible to communicate risk, so using maps, having the reports or running the simulations, bringing data to dialogue, so role play simulations, you're integrating the data into conversation. As well, don't trust the conventional wisdom. So we learned from the polling data that what we thought people thought wasn't what they thought. And that's probably not just a New England thing. And be ready to transition. So use the momentum to continue the work. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to transition over to questions.
Thanks, Annie. Got about 12 minutes left for questions and answers here. Oh, got another link here, looks like. So yeah, just to reiterate, these resources are available at NECAP's website. I myself have spent a fair amount of time, especially recently, digging through that website and getting lost in the many corners of it. So I can vouch for there's a lot of interesting content there to look at. So with that, we have time for some more questions. We'll kind of roll back and look at some of the questions that are already kind of lined up in here, because there are a fair few of them. One question here that I will first give a little bit of context for. So some communities might not be as concerned about that, or might not be convinced that role-playing would be seen as a serious tool for addressing local issues. How did you market the role-playing events? Did that play a role in kind of the community perception and what kind of attendance you were getting?
This is Maeve. Yeah, actually, that was a really important aspect of getting people to these workshops, was how we communicated about it. In particular, I think within the Consensus Building Institute, it was just kind of the normal lingo to refer to role play simulations as games, like and a lot of times it would be serious games, but we found that that phrasing of it really did not resonate with people here, and it sounded like this is not serious. This does not sound like we're we're actually going to lead to any real life outcomes if we're just playing a game. So we really backed away from that language around it and mostly tried to say like role play simulation exercise.
Yeah, and this is Annie. You probably heard when I was talking, I backpedaled away from saying games, but it was ingrained. And just the same as Maeve said, it is difficult to get adults to come into a room and play a game.
Great. I have another question here. What timeline into the future were your scenarios? Or when participants think about climate change risks were relevant? So they've listed a couple of timelines: now, 5 years, 10, 20, 30, etc. So essentially, how concerned about it were people now? And if not now, when is the threshold for concern?
Well, I would say the context of our county is that with these repetitive disasters that we've had, we're sort of in a reactive mindset. So even though we started every workshop with climate projection data and said, this is all about planning, we and this is, I think, sort of dependent on the local context, but our experience was that it was difficult to get people to think outside of very short term, like, because they are just now recovering from last year's flood. And it is like every September, people are just bracing for the impacts. So we tried to emphasize that this was about adapting to future impacts, but it was hard to break that cycle of reactivity that people seem focused on right now.
We have a few people here asking about the budgeting for these. So is there anything you can say about the budgeting for developing the scenarios? And I guess there's another one here that's asking about the budgeting for the project in general, staffing size, funding level, et cetera. Any of those details?
Well, for our project, we had a few different subcontracts, including the CISA scientists who produced the downscaled projections. There was money for near staff time to work on this project. And then we had a subcontract with the Consensus Building Institute and their staff who helped to develop the case study. And then additional budget was training materials such as printing or food for the community workshops, just, general supplies. Annie, anything else that I'm not thinking about?
No, that sounds about right, since it was a transfer.
Mm-hmm.
Got a question here about federal government involvement. Did people specify what they expected the federal government to do during the New England Climate Adaptation polling? Has this mindset changed at all in the last couple of years?
I would imagine it has changed. I'm not sure about, I don't think they got into the specifics with the polling question. It would be great to go and poll everyone again and see what the shift has been.
It's actually interesting. I was thinking about that earlier as well. That was another question I was going to ask, is if you saw any kind of perceived differences between the two, because in my mind it kind of stands out that there's a fairly small gap between the two projects that occurred, but it's crazy the shift in perception that can occur in such a short amount of time. I was just curious if you have any comments on that.
Sorry, can you rephrase that for me?
Sure. Do you think there's any sort of do you have any opinions on the shift, any kind of shifts in perception over the last 5 years, or in smaller time frames, like a 5 to 10 year time frame? Do you have any comments on just how people's perceptions may change?
Oh, sure. So, I think before we were using this simulation and doing climate work, we were still on the fence about using terms like climate change with the public. And now I feel like there has been a shift in perception, and it's fine to use that. I don't find it here to be, I don't worry about offending people, or it's not as polarizing as it is in other places in the country.
Yeah, we're earlier in the follow-up to the project, but I would say it's similar, and it's also that much easier to be able to talk about the importance of climate or the support for stakeholder engagement, having collected this data, not just the climate projections, but also the community surveys. So it's just that extra justification when you're then talking to decision maker audiences.
Thank you. I'll kind of switch gears here to an earlier question that we received that I'm afraid I missed earlier when I was reading through this, but were either of your projects informed by any resilience plans in other areas? And they suggested a couple examples here. They said New Haven, Connecticut, Wilmington, North Carolina, or Boca Raton.
I don't believe so, not for us.
When we developed, we wrote like an executive briefing that it's publicly available, but we produced it for our report out to our county council, and we did share several models. One was the city of Tybee Island in Georgia, because they have a similar have similar challenges with sea level rise and transportation, and they did a stakeholder engagement process, basically the role play simulation, but they, like Annie said, they said, let's make this real, let's do it. So they use community input to develop prioritized adaptation actions. So we provided that as a resource and a recommendation.
Were there any other games that might have informed your work or any other books? I think we had a couple examples introduced here. Let me scroll back up and find them. I think the ones they mentioned were Game of Floods, and there's another one here. Game of Floods and Game of Extremes. Do either of those ring a bell?
So for me, I think, Nick, you put in the chat a link for serious games for coastal and marine conservation, management, and adaptation. And I believe that those games that you're referring to are in that link. But I was not familiar, I wasn't even familiar with role play simulations around coastal management in 2012.
Yeah, similarly, this was all new to me. This was a totally novel approach for me to try out. Since then, yeah, I've learned more about the literature around simulations, and I've heard of Game of Floods, but I haven't gotten to try it out myself.
Did you happen to notice if any professions were more interested than others in engaging in these simulations?
Yeah, so I think, as Maeve had said, we definitely were, the people who signed up to come and participate in the workshops were already interested in environmental issues. It was harder to get people who are not to come.
Yeah, similar. We did have, it was great to see so many elected officials and local government staff, in particular, like public works departments, stormwater departments. They were well represented, and we did have some business owners, just like individual small business owners who participated and were pretty vocal about the impacts that they personally have had from like storms and flooding.
All right, we are just about out of time. I did want to run as close to the end of our time as we possibly could, because I know we had some technical difficulties at the beginning. So again, thank you everyone for sticking with us while we sorted those out. Just a couple announcements as we wrap up. We do have quite a few upcoming webinars scheduled already. February 26th, our next one, that's going to feature Chris Ford from the Wells Reserve, and she'll be presenting on the resilience dialogues and the work in that project. And then in March, we actually have two webinars coming up, one March 11th and one March 17th. March 11th will be quantifying nutrient retention, and that's Lake Erie coastal watershed, and they have some interesting products that they have come out with recently that we will also send out ahead of that webinar. And then on March 17th, we'll be having our next panel webinar, and the topic will be blue carbon. And all of those are available for registration on our website, so neurosciencecollaborative.org. And we'll just wrap with a big thank you to our speakers for taking the time to be with us and putting together these great presentations and answering all of our questions. We'll be sending out a webinar brief within the next couple of weeks as we wrap that up. It will be the slide deck plus summary points, kind of talking through what the presenters presented during their presentations. And the YouTube recording will be available in the next couple of days as well. So if anybody has any questions, they can, of course, email myself or the NERRS info web address, and we'll end with a big thank you to Maeve and Annie for being with us today. So Maeve and Annie, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.